Have you ever sat down to meditate with the best of intentions, hoping maybe to slow down an anxious, busy mind, only to stand up and feel even more anxious and have your mind be even more busy? Or maybe you were low and lethargic, feeling a bit depressed, sat down to meditate with that intention to align yourself, to uplift yourself, only to feel even worse after sitting to meditate. This is an article from the New Zealand Herald. Miguel Farias, meditation can be harmful and even worse in mental health problems. A really interesting, enlightening read sent through to me by one of the bros, Dan, and we had a back and forth that he felt was enlightening, so recommended I share it with you, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm Adam, your trauma-informed breathwork facilitator, changing the world one breath at a time, helping you connect with your highest form of being, bliss, from our well of bliss. Breathe Ananda NZ. Let's get into it. Mindfulness can be harmful and can even worsen mental health problems, according to Associate Professor. Mindfulness can be used to calm the mind and body, yet proponents often ignore evidence and experiences that point towards its potential to cause harm. Miguel Farias is an associate professor in experimental psychology at Coventry New University. The opinion is, since mindfulness is something you can practice at home for free, it often sounds like the perfect tonic for stress and mental health issues. Mindfulness is a type of Buddhist-based meditation in which you focus on being aware of what you're sensing, thinking, and feeling in the present moment. The first recorded evidence for this is found in India, is over 1,500 years old. The Dhammatratta meditation scripture, written by a community of Buddhists, describes various practices and includes reports of symptoms of depression and anxiety that can occur after meditation. It also details cognitive anomalies associated with episodes of psychosis, dissociation, and depersonalization when people feel the world is unreal. In the past 8 years, there has been a surge of scientific research in this area. These studies show that adverse effects are not rare. A 2022 study using a sample of 953 people in the United States who meditated regularly showed that over 10% of participants experienced adverse effects which had a significant negative impact on their everyday life and lasted for at least 1 month. According to a review of more than 40 years of research that was published in 2020, the most common adverse effects are anxiety and depression. These are followed by psychotic or delusional symptoms, dissociation or depersonalization, and fear or terror. Research also found that adverse effects can happen to people without previous mental health problems, to those who have only had a moderate exposure to meditation, and they can lead to long-lasting symptoms. The Western world has also had evidence about these adverse effects for a long time. In 1976, Arnold Lazarus, a key figure in the cognitive behavioral science movement, said that meditation, when used indiscriminately, could induce serious psychiatric problems such as depression, agitation, or even schizophrenic decompensation. There's evidence that mindfulness can benefit people's well-being. The problem is that mindfulness coaches, videos, apps, and books rarely warn people about the potential for adverse effects. Professor of Management and ordained Buddhist teacher Ronald Purser wrote in his 2023 book, Mindfulness, that mindfulness has become a kind of capitalist spirituality. In the US alone, meditation is worth $2.2 billion. And the senior figures in the mindfulness industry should be aware of the problems with meditation. John Kabat-Zinn, a key figure behind the mindfulness movement, admitted in a 2017 interview with The Guardian that 90% of the research into positive impacts is subpar. In his foreword to the 2015 UK Mindfulness All-Party Parliamentary Report, Kabat-Zinn suggests that mindfulness meditation can eventually transform who we are as human beings and individual citizens, as communities and societies, as nations, and as a species. This religious-like enthusiasm for the power of mindfulness to change not only the individual, but the course of humanity is common among advocates. Even many atheists and agnostics who practice mindfulness believe that this practice has the power to increase peace and compassion in the world. Many discussions of mindfulness has also been somewhat imbalanced. In 2015, my book with clinical psychologist Catherine Walkholm, Buddha Pill, included a chapter summarizing the research on meditation's adverse effects. It was widely disseminated by the media, including New Scientist article and a BBC Radio 4 documentary, but there was little media coverage in 2022 of the most expensive study in the history of meditation science, which involved US $8 million, funded by research charity the Wellcome Trust. The study tested more than 8,000 children aged 11 to 14 across 84 schools in the United Kingdom from 2016 to 2018. Its results showed that mindfulness failed to improve the mental well-being of children compared to a control group, and may even have had detrimental effects on those who were at risk of mental health problems. Ethical implications. It is ethical to sell mindfulness apps to teach people teach people meditation classes, or even use mindfulness in a clinical practice without mentioning its adverse effects? Is it? Given the evidence of how varied and common these effects are, the answer should be no. However, many meditation and mindfulness instructors believe that these practices can only do good and don't know about the potential for adverse effects. The most common account I hear from people who have suffered adverse meditation effects is that teachers don't believe them. They're usually told to just keep meditating and it will go away. Research about how to safely practice meditation has only begun, which means there isn't yet clear advice to give people. There's a wider problem in that meditation deals with unusual states of consciousness, and we don't have psychological theories of mind to help us understand these states. But there are resources people can use to learn about these adverse effects. These include websites produced by meditators who experience serious adverse effects and academic handbooks with dedicated sections to this topic. In the US, there is a clinical service dedicated to people who have experienced acute and long-term problems led by a mindfulness researcher. For now, if meditation is to be used as a well-being or therapeutic tool, the public needs to be informed about its potential for harm. So let's unpack this article. I've made 17 points that I've picked out, and I'll talk to each of them individually. So the first is that proponents of meditation often ignore evidence and experiences that point towards its potential to cause harm. So this raises a really good and fair point that it's really important to look at who you're dealing with, who you're working with, and make sure that they have some sort of qualification, that they're trauma informed, preferably, so they understand these adverse effects. What I disagree with is that it's often ignored, that adverse effects are often ignored. If you have a reputable person that you're working with, someone with experience and someone with some qualifications, or simply a long connection to the practice, an honest connection to the practice, that have lived and worked through it with others, and more importantly done the work themselves, they'll know intuitively that it's not for everyone. It's not a fix-all, that there are practices that need to be done maybe prior to engaging in meditation to prepare the body-mind system for that state of deep theta brainwave activity, altered states of consciousness, which we'll talk to in a future point, and get the most out of a meditation practice. It does have the potential to change a lot of things, but it's important to set the body up right for success rather than diving in and saying that it's for everyone. So that's point one. Point two, Dharma trusted meditation scriptures include reports of various adverse effects of meditation. So what he's saying there is that even going back 1500 years in the scripture, that there are reports of these adverse effects, which is true. And again, that talks to the previous point that if you're dealing with someone who is reputable, who has experience, who is well grounded in the practice of meditation, they'll understand these adverse effects. Number three, there's been a surge in scientific research over the past 8 years showing adverse effects are not rare. A 2022 study of 953 people showed over 10% experience impacts that impacted their everyday life and lasted at least 1 month. So 10%, is that rare? Is that not rare? Regardless of the fact, it does talk to that point again, that it's really important to understand that the adverse effects are there, that they can occur. And so what that means is it's a person-to-person thing. You can't say that meditation will heal X. We need to understand where the person who's being facilitated, who's coming to receive the tool, where they're at energetically to begin with. So whether they're suffering from depression, whether they're suffering from anxiety, often with most of our containers, what we do to begin with is we either have a questionnaire or we talk to a energy rating scale. So am I feeling low and lethargic, 1 at that end of the scale, or am I feeling 10 anxious and hyperactive on the other end of the scale, or somewhere in between, 5 being perfectly balanced. So this gives us an understanding of where the individuals are at, and it's also very important to always allow an out for the individual being part of the practice to listen to their body, to stand up and leave if they're not feeling right, not to put pressure on them to stay put when they feel uncomfortable. So it's really about connecting with your own body-mind system and tapping into what your energetic requirements are at that point in time. So that was actually 2 points. So point number 5 is, according to a review of over 40 years of research published in 2020, most common adverse events are anxiety and depression, followed by psychotic or delusional symptoms, dissociation, depersonalization, fear, etc. Again, so this just talks to the fact that adverse events do exist. That's a review of over 40 40 years of research show the most common are anxiety and depression, which are broadly the most common sort of mental health issues in general. And again, it talks to that spectrum. So understanding where we are energetically. And what I want to touch on at this point is having an understanding of the autonomic nervous system is so vital, not only for the practitioner, but also for you as the person receiving the tool. If you have an understanding of the spectrum and the gears of your autonomic nervous system, the different states you can be in at any point in time, low lethargic depression that is aligned with what's called a dorsal vagal response, where our energy isn't being deployed, where we're in a freeze or fawn response, we're in that low state of energy. And if you're in that low state of energy and you go to meditate, often you can have adverse effects and it can deepen what you're feeling in that moment. Conversely, if you're hyper aroused in that anxious state, this is an activation of what's called the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Your pupils are going to be dilated, your heart's going to be beating faster, your blood pressure is higher. There's that anxious state where you're in that state of fight or flight. And so what that means is, again, you're not primed to sit down and meditate. If you sit down and meditate in that state, you may exacerbate the symptoms, or even in worst case scenario lead to dissociation or psychosis and these more extreme things. So what it comes down to is, what state am I in before I sit down to meditate? Maybe there's other practices I can do to prepare my body and put myself into what's called a ventral vagal state, a state of social engagement, of safety, before I sit into the meditation and get so I can get the most out of that meditation. So point 6, it can happen. So adverse effects can happen to people with no mental health history or issues in their mental health history, and with only moderate exposure to meditation, and can lead to long-lasting symptoms. So absolutely, again, that speaks to my last point, that we need to know where we're at energetically, that even moderate exposure to meditation can lead to long-lasting adverse effects. So again, if you've tapped in and understand what your autonomic state is before you sit down to meditate, you'll know whether or not you're ready to sit down and meditate, and therefore you can avoid those serious adverse events. Point number 7, 1976, Arnold Lazarus, who was that cognitive behavioral therapist, I believe, said that meditation, when used indiscriminately, can induce serious psychiatric problems. Yes, absolutely. So I completely agree on that. It can induce serious psychiatric problems. And again, the point, indiscriminately. So we need to be discerning about when and how we use meditation as a mindfulness tool. Mindfulness coaches, videos, apps, and books really warn people about their adverse effects. So again, I would say it's not rare that people are warned about adverse effects. It comes down to the grounding of the facilitator. So if you're dealing with a grounded facilitator, they will be aware and they will advise you, and they will be cognizant of adverse effects. Number 9, Ronald Purser referred to capitalist spirituality. So this is the nature of the Western world. We're in a capitalist society. A lot of people are here to make money, and that means that some people may not be pure in the way they approach these practices. They may be in it for a buck. And so that comes down to an individual's discernment when you're researching your facilitator, just like you would if you were researching a psychologist you were going to work with. You want to be cognizant of their qualifications. You want to have a vibe check, so to speak, and make sure that you interact with them and you trust them. You trust your instincts with them, and you listen to your intuition as well. John Kabat-Zinn, JKZ, 90% of research on benefits is subpar. Also said it can eventually transform who we are as human beings, and therefore as a species. So what he's saying there is that some of the claims can sound quite expansive or lofty when it comes to meditation, and what that comes down to is a passion for the practice. When you have experienced transformative moments with these practices, which can happen, that leads to passion, and that leads to enthusiasm, and that leads to claims like this, which I believe are true. But really, I mean, what he's talking to is the hyperbole that he says 90% of research is subpar on the benefits, that is. So that's an opinion. What I would say, though, is that usually if things are published in a scientific journal, actually I'll walk that back because who knows. But we want to be cognizant of whether things are peer-reviewed, what the intentions of the articles being published are. But really, you can work around all of that if you understand your individual circumstances, because you're not one of those 953 participants in that one research study. You are that one person that is yourself. And so if you understand what your energetic requirements are, if you understand your autonomic nervous system, if you're connected with your mind and body, you can use the right tool in the right moment, whether that be meditation, whether it be a body-based practice like somatic movement, like using the breath in a different, in any different sort of form, whether it be activating breath work, calming breath work, cleansing breath work. You use that in the moment to shift you to the state that is preferable, whether that be a flow state or whether that be a calm, safe, and socially engaged ventral vagal state. Number 11, religious-like enthusiasm for mindfulness is common. Religious-like, I mean, don't really know exactly what that means, but there's definitely enthusiasm. And I would say, yeah, it's common, because if you've felt the effects and the benefits, then you want to share that with other people. What it comes down to is being discerning about when and how to use it, about, again, not overstating the benefits without understanding the adverse effects as well. So finding that balance, balancing passion with pragmatism, I guess, is what you could say. Number 12, media is imbalanced on adverse effects. 2022 study of N 8,000 UK kids, 11 to 14, between 2016 and 18, showed mindfulness failed to improve mental well-being and may have detrimental effects for those who are at risk of mental health problems. So again, that's one study that's being quoted of 8,000 people, and he's saying that that wasn't well reported. So I guess the general point is that adverse effects aren't being as well reported as possibly the benefits, and that more education needs to be shared on those adverse effects, which I don't disagree with. I think it's very important, as we've already covered, that those adverse effects be acknowledged and that the individuals at risk understand what tool they're using and how it's going to affect their autonomic nervous system and the possibilities of, if you use the wrong tool, those adverse effects happening. Number 30, many mindfulness and meditation instructors believe it can only do good and don't know about potential adverse effects. Again, this is going back to an earlier point. I wouldn't say that many mindfulness and meditation instructions believe that it can only do good. If they're educated, if they have a grounded understanding and an experiential grounding in the practice, they understand that it's not a cure-all, that there are other tools that can be used alongside it, and that if they're trauma-informed, if they have some sort of grounding outside of just the practice itself, to understand the autonomic nervous system, to understand trauma and how a meditation practice can affect that trauma, being liberated from the body and the mind, and what that can lead to, then they will do what's right and keep their students safe from those adverse effects. They'll put safeguards in place. Number 14, most common account he refers to from those experienced adverse effects is that the practitioner doesn't believe them and tells them to just keep practicing. Okay, so that's an individual anecdote from himself, saying that that's the most common account. Again, I'd be asking the question as to the facilitator, whether or not they have a grounded understanding of the adverse effects and have a pure intention in terms of the practice, because a lot of it's about no struggle, no strain. We talk about ahimsa, non-violence, so non-violence towards yourself. You're not trying to push yourself through adverse sensations and feelings. You're being at peace and equanimous, whether that means standing up and leaving the meditation because you're not in the right state, or just being at peace in the moment with slight bits of agitation and allowing them to move through you. It comes down to that discernment, which is led by the facilitator. Number 15, research on how to safely practice meditation has only just begun. Therefore, what? Therefore, we shouldn't practice? Or I think he refers earlier to 1,500 years ago about those adverse effects, and many of the ancient texts, I don't have any to refer to right now, but that grounded understanding in a practitioner that has been through it, that understands that meditation and mindfulness is a tool to be used in a certain time when the mind and body is prepared, and that there are other practices to be done alongside it, will share that fact that there are guardrails, there are exceptions, there always are for the individual, and that they should be adhered to. But number 16, this is an important one. Meditation deals with unusual states of consciousness. He refers to them as unusual states of consciousness that we don't have psychological theories to fully understand. We do. I talk about brainwave states. So what we're moving into is into that theta brainwave state, which drops us into our subconscious mind, which can access previous repressed memories if there's trauma there that can come through in those moments. And if we're not prepared and we're not resourced to deal with them, then they can lead to some of those adverse effects. So we're talking about brainwave states. We're talking about unordinary states of consciousness. And again, if we're resourced and we have a practitioner that understands what can the benefits of these states, but also the drawbacks as well, then it can be leveraged to get the most out of the practice. So the final point is, if meditation is to be used, the public needs to be informed about its adverse events. Absolutely. Completely agree with that. No arguments there at all. It's all about understanding the grounding of the practitioner you're working with, understanding empowering yourself with the knowledge of your own autonomic nervous system so you can be discerning about where you're at in the moment, whether that tool, meditation or mindfulness, is the tool to be used, or if something else should be done first. So I just want to briefly speak to, because this has gone quite long, briefly speak to the 8 limbs of yoga, and specifically the 3 that are, I think, important to lead, or the 2 that should lead us into meditation. So asana, or asan, is movement, is the postures we do in yoga that prepare our body for that meditation practice. So not just on a physical level, but they can actually start to move energy on a somatic level to open up and release stored tension, which is not just physical tension. It's actually representative of possibly deeper psychological traumatic blockages in the nervous system. So we can prepare the body through movement practices, whether it be asan, somatic movement, qigong. We can use those to prepare our body for meditation. So maybe it's more appropriate that we do those before we sit down to meditate if our energetic system is in a state of dysregulation. The other thing is the breath. So pranayama is another of the 8 limbs of yoga. And what that gives us control of is the energy within our body. So prana is life force energy, ayama is to extend, yama is to control. So control of that life force energy within our body through the breath can be a great way to prepare our body for that meditation practice. If our mind is running, we can use slow breathing practices to calm our body into a ventral vagal state. If we feel low and lethargic, maybe we need a little bit more energy to pick us up out of that dorsal vagal state to return us to that center, that ventral vagal, safe, socially engaged state before we practice meditation. So these are just a few ideas, just a few opinions. I'd love to know what you think about this. If you got to the end and listened to it all, what you think of this article, what your opinions are, what your experiences have been. Share them down in the comments. Hit like, follow, subscribe, all those nice things. And as always, stay blessed. Namaste.